A young black boy saved the life of a pregnant policewoman in a dangerous situation. Little did he know, his courageous act would not only save her life, but also bring justice and change the fate of his own family. Before diving into this emotional story, make sure to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to follow more meaningful journeys like this. The bustling street was alive as always, filled with the blaring of car horns and the chatter of passers-by blending into the sweltering morning air. Ethan moved quickly along the cracked sidewalks, weaving past street vendors and hurried pedestrians. The neighborhood was always lively but chaotic, much like Ethan's life itself. In his jacket pocket, his father's old watch rubbed against the fabric. The watch had stopped working long ago, but to Ethan, it was more than just a keepsake. It was a symbol of faith. His father's words, Daniel's, echoed in his mind every time he held it. Justice is something you can't give up on, Ethan. Even when no one believes, you have to believe. His father was wrongfully imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, leaving Ethan's family to scrape by while his mother, Helen, worked tirelessly at the laundromat. Today, like every other day, Ethan crossed the busy main road on his way to school, his mind preoccupied with the unfinished tasks at home. But he didn't know that this day would be different. At the street corner, Ethan noticed a female police officer directing traffic. It was Rebecca, a familiar face. She was one of the few officers Ethan had seen who smiled at the kids in the neighborhood. But today, she looked tired. Beneath her uniform, her slightly swollen belly was visible, a sign that she was pregnant. Ethan thought to himself, "She's still working, even when she's pregnant?" Rebecca stood in the middle of the road, signaling the cars behind her to stop so a large truck could reverse into a side lane. As the truck nearly finished backing up, a panicked shout erupted from down the street. "Watch out! The bike!" Ethan turned his head. A man was hurtling toward them on a bicycle, his handlebars wobbling out of control. The bike veered wildly as the man shouted, trying to regain balance. The bike's trajectory was clear. It was heading straight for Rebecca, who was completely unaware. She had her back turned to the man, focused on managing traffic. Time seemed to slow down. Ethan looked around, hoping someone would yell or do something, but no one moved. A few people simply stood frozen, holding up their phones to record the scene. Instinct kicked in, and Ethan bolted forward. "Ma'am, look out!" Ethan shouted, sprinting toward Rebecca with everything he had. Rebecca turned her head, just in time to see the bike barreling toward her. But before it could hit her, Ethan had already reached her, pushing her gently to the side. Both of them. Staggered, Rebecca nearly losing her balance, Ethan quickly grabbed her elbow to steady her. The man on the bike wobbled and skidded to a halt just a few steps away. The bicycle crashed to the ground with a loud clatter, taking the rider with it. He lay on the pavement, breathing heavily but seemingly uninjured. A small crowd began to gather, whispering and murmuring amongst themselves. Rebecca, one hand resting protectively on her belly, turned to the boy. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "If it weren't for you—" Ethan shook his head, trying to steady his breathing despite his pounding heart. "I just saw you couldn't move in time. Are you hurt? Does anything hurt?" Rebecca shook her head, taking a deep breath to regain her composure, but Ethan noticed the sweat on her forehead. "You should sit down," Ethan said, his eyes full of concern. "I think you need to rest for a bit." Reluctantly, Rebecca sat on the nearby steps, still cradling her stomach. A man from the crowd stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "What's that kid up to? Causing trouble?" Ethan felt the judgmental stares from those around him, but ignored them. He crouched down to look at Rebecca, his face tense. "Are you really okay? Should we call an ambulance?" Before Rebecca could respond, a loud voice called out from behind. "Rebecca, are you all right?" Ethan turned to see a tall man in a police uniform striding quickly toward them. It was Jack, Rebecca's husband and the police chief. His face was etched with worry as he approached. Rebecca looked up at her husband. "I'm fine. This boy helped me avoid a bad accident. If it weren't for him, things could have been much worse." Jack turned his gaze to Ethan, his eyes initially filled with suspicion, but they softened when he saw the genuine concern in the boy's expression. He crouched down, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Thank you, son. What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy answered softly. Jack nodded, his face serious but warm. "Ethan, you saved my family today. I owe you a big thanks." Ethan hesitated for a moment before shaking Jack's outstretched hand. He had no idea that his small act today would go on to change his life forever. Rebecca sat on the steps, her hands resting lightly on her knees, taking deep breaths to steady herself. Jack knelt beside her, his eyes fixed on her with concern. "Are you sure you're okay? Do you need to go to the hospital?" Jack asked, his voice a mix of worry and tension. Rebecca shook her head, offering a faint smile. "I'm fine, Jack. Really, I'm okay. Thank goodness for Ethan," she said, glancing at the boy, standing a few steps away. Ethan stood there, looking anxious, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack. He didn't know what to do next, but deep inside he felt a sense of relief for having done the right thing. Jack stood up and walked over to the boy. His towering figure cast a shadow over Ethan, but his eyes no longer held the suspicion they had earlier. Instead, they were filled with sincere gratitude. "Ethan, I don't know how to thank you. If it weren't for you, things could have been so much worse." Ethan just nodded, unsure of what to say. Jack continued, "You did something incredible today. Is there anything I can do to thank you? Anything at all. Just say the word." The unexpected offer left Ethan stunned. His mind raced with thoughts. Part of him wanted to say he didn't need anything. Helping Rebecca had been the right thing to do. But then, an image of his father, Daniel, came to mind. The father he trusted and loved, who was now behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Ethan swallowed hard, then looked up at Jack with determined eyes. His voice trembled, but his gaze was steady. "I don't need anything for myself, but I want you to investigate my dad's case." Jack froze, surprised by the boy's request. He hadn't expected such a plea. The murmurs of the nearby crowd grew louder, with a few puzzled glances exchanged. "Your dad?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice even. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath to muster his courage. "My dad's name is Daniel Carter. He was arrested for theft, but he's innocent. I know he's innocent. I just want you to look into it, please." The boy's voice cracked, and he fought to hold back his emotions. Rebecca, who had now stood up, approached Ethan. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, sensing the turmoil within him. "Jack, maybe we should listen to him," Rebecca said, her gaze encouraging her husband. Jack remained silent for a few moments, clearly deliberating. Reopening an old case often meant headaches, big ones, If there truly had been a mistake, it could have significant repercussions for his entire department. But Ethan's eyes, filled with faith and hope, made it impossible for Jack to dismiss the boy outright. Jack knelt down, meeting Ethan's gaze. His voice was firm but compassionate. "All right, Ethan. I'm not promising anything yet, but I'll look into it. Can you tell me more? About your dad?" Ethan bit his lip, his eyes lighting up with a glimmer of hope. He quickly began recounting the story. His father, Daniel, was a kind and hard-working man who had been employed at a security company. One day, he was accused of stealing goods from the company's warehouse. The evidence against him was damning. Security footage showed someone resembling him, and another employee's testimony confirmed it. But Ethan knew his father couldn't have done it. Daniel had always lived by principles, working tirelessly to provide for his family. He often said, "I'd rather lose my job than do something wrong." Jack listened intently, nodding occasionally. He could sense Ethan's conviction, though he knew it wasn't enough to clear Daniel's name. "Do you know anything else? Anything that might help?" Jack asked. Ethan thought for a moment, then pulled an old watch from his pocket and placed it in Jack's hand. "This is my dad's watch. On the day he was arrested, he left it at home. But when they showed me the security footage, the person in it was wearing a watch just like this. I know it wasn't my dad." Jack examined the watch, his expression growing more serious. A small detail, but it could be an important clue. He nodded, as though reaching a decision. "All right, Ethan, I'll start with this." Before leaving, Rebecca knelt down and looked at Ethan with a kind smile. "Ethan, you're not just brave, you're an amazing son. Don't lose faith, okay?" Ethan smiled back, feeling a sense of comfort for the first time that day. As Jack and Rebecca walked away, Ethan stood still, watching them go. A faint flicker of hope lit up inside him. Hope that justice might finally come for his father. Jack sat in his office, the dim light from his desk lamp casting a faint glow over the old case file in front of him. On the cover of the file was the name Daniel Carter, written in bold ink. This was the case Ethan had mentioned, the warehouse theft from a year ago that led to Daniel's imprisonment. Jack sighed, flipping through the pages. Initial complaint. A high-value shipment had gone missing from the warehouse. Security cameras captured an image of a man resembling Daniel leaving the premises on the night of the incident. Key evidence. The testimony of another employee who claimed to have seen Daniel in the warehouse after hours. On paper, the case seemed straightforward, the evidence compelling, and Daniel was convicted without much difficulty. But Jack, with his years of experience as a detective, knew that the truth often lay beneath the surface. Especially after Ethan's account and the peculiar detail about the watch, a small but suspicious clue. Jack held the watch in his hand, recalling Ethan's words. "My dad wasn't wearing his watch that day, but the person in the video was." If this was true, someone might have fabricated evidence. Jack called in the original investigative team from Daniel Carter's case, including Lieutenant Mason, who had led the operation. Mason was a seasoned officer, known for his toughness but also his tendency to use creative methods to achieve results. "Chief, you want us to revisit the Carter case?" Mason frowned at the request. "That case has been closed for over a year. I thought everything was crystal clear." Jack crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. "I've received a complaint from Carter's family. There are details that need clarification, particularly regarding the surveillance footage and the witness testimony. Mason shrugged, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. You know, Carter's already serving his sentence. Reopening this case is just going to waste our time and might tarnish the team's reputation. Jack's voice remained calm but resolute. We're not investigating to protect reputations. We're investigating to uphold justice. Mason hesitated but eventually nodded. All right, Chief, I'll pull the reports. Jack didn't miss the look Mason gave him as he left, a mix of annoyance and reluctance, as though this investigation was an unnecessary burden. As Jack reviewed the evidence, he noticed something unusual about the surveillance footage. The beginning of the video was clear, but when it showed the figure leaving the warehouse, the frames became unnaturally blurred. Jack frowned. Was this a technical glitch or deliberate tampering? He requested the forensic team to recover the original footage, only to learn that the source data had been erased. Next, Jack tracked down the key witness in the case, Paul Stanford, a former warehouse employee. Paul's testimony had been one of the critical pieces of evidence against Daniel. However, when Jack contacted Paul, his response was unexpected. I don't want to talk about that anymore, sir. Please don't call me again. Paul hung up abruptly, leaving Jack with an uneasy feeling. A primary witness withdrawing cooperation was far from ordinary. While Jack was struggling to make headway, Ethan suddenly appeared at the police station carrying a small bag. Inside was an item he had found in his father's belongings. Uncle Jack, I think this might help, Ethan said, placing the bag on Jack's desk. Jack opened it to find a swipe card, the kind used to access the warehouse. Ethan explained that his father had accidentally brought it home right before he was arrested. My dad said he forgot to return the card that day, but if he didn't enter the warehouse on the night of the theft, someone else might have used it to frame him. Jack examined the card, his eyes lighting up. This could be a vital clue. The card might have logs showing the time and user ID of each entry. He immediately handed it over to the tech department for analysis. Not long after Jack delved deeper into the case, he received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end was raspy and menacing. Drop it, Jack. If you know what's good for you, leave the Carter case alone. Otherwise, you'll lose more than just your reputation. Jack gripped the phone tightly, sweat trickling down his temple. This was the first time he realized the case was far more complicated than it seemed. Behind it, there might be an entire network of corruption or a larger conspiracy. But Jack didn't back down. He knew that from this point forward, every step he took would bring him closer to the truth and closer to danger. Jack walked into the tech office with a tense expression. The access card Ethan had brought him was the only new lead he had, and he needed to be sure it held valuable information. The technician, a young man named Ryan, inserted the card into the reader. The system logs every use of the card, including time and location, Ryan explained. We just need to wait a moment for it to load the data. Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. Minutes later, the data began to appear. Jack held his breath as a particular entry stood out. The card was last used at 10:35 p.m., the night of the theft. Jack frowned. This was a critical moment in the case. But something was strange. The user ID on the card didn't match Daniel's employee ID. What does this mean? Jack asked, his voice serious. Ryan looked up, his face slightly confused. It means someone impersonated Mr. Daniel when using this card. Jack returned to his office, a deep unease growing inside him. If the access card had been misused, it was also likely that the surveillance footage had been tampered with. This strengthened his suspicion that the case was being manipulated from within. He reviewed the list of warehouse employees present at the time of the theft. One name stood out: Paul Stanford, the key witness who had retracted his statement and cut off communication. Jack decided to confront Paul in person. After hours of searching, he found himself standing in front of a dilapidated apartment. Paul opened the door, his face anxious when he saw Jack. "I told you, I don't want anything to do with this anymore," Paul said, his voice hoarse. Jack placed a firm hand on the door, preventing it from closing. "I'm not here to bother you. I just want the truth. If you don't speak now, you may never get another chance. Do you want to live with this guilt forever?" Paul hesitated, his gaze shifting as if waging an internal battle. Finally, he sighed and invited Jack inside. Paul sat on a worn-out chair, his hands trembling as they clutched each other. He began to speak. They forced me to say I saw Daniel in the warehouse, but the truth is, I didn't see anything. I was just working late that night, and when the theft happened, I wasn't even near the scene." Jack clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. "Who forced you?" Paul shook his head, fear flooding his eyes. "I can't say. If I do, they'll come for me. I've seen what they can do." Jack knew he couldn't push Paul any further for now, but Paul's confession confirmed that his testimony in the case had been fabricated. Daniel had been framed by those trying to cover up something much larger. When Jack returned to the police station, he sought out Lieutenant Mason. "Mason, I just spoke to Paul Stanford. He admitted to being coerced into giving false testimony. I need you to explain this," Jack demanded, his tone stern. Mason met Jack's gaze, his lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment of silence, Mason smirked. "Do you really want to know, Jack? Sometimes we have to do what it takes to close a case." Jack felt anger rising within him. He shot up from his chair, slamming his fist on the desk. "Do what it takes? Do you even hear yourself? This is an innocent man's life we're talking about." Mason stood, meeting Jack's glare with cold eyes. "Careful, Jack. Digging into settled matters isn't always a good idea. Not everyone wants the truth to come out." Jack stepped back, his heart heavy. Now, he wasn't just fighting to clear Daniel's name, he was also up against a traitor within his own team. The next day, Jack received shocking news. The access card data he had sent for analysis had been erased from the system. Someone on the inside had deliberately deleted it. Jack knew this was a calculated move to stall the investigation. Jack called an emergency meeting, but he was met with silence and a few vague responses. It was clear that someone in the team was protecting this secret at all costs. That night, Jack sat alone in his office, the desk lamp casting a dim glow over Daniel's case file. He knew that continuing the investigation would put him in greater danger, but Ethan's hopeful eyes and his desperate plea echoed in Jack's mind. Jack gripped the watch Ethan had given him, drawing strength from it. He made his decision. "No matter what, I will bring the truth to light." Jack stepped out of the police station, the frigid night air pressing down on him like the weight of the darkness he was facing. In his hand was the watch Ethan had given him, the only tangible link to a case where the truth was sinking deeper into obscurity. Standing outside the station, Jack called Rebecca. "Rebecca, I need you. Meet me at home right away. It's important," Jack said curtly before hanging up. At home, Jack laid everything out: the tampered video footage, Paul Stanford's coerced confession, the erased keycard data, and Mason's betrayal. Rebecca listened, her expression growing increasingly tense. "Jack, you know that if you keep pushing, you'll be up against everyone trying to bury this," Rebecca said, her voice low. Jack nodded and exhaled deeply. "I know, but I can't turn back. For Ethan, for Daniel, and for you. You know, that boy's saved. You without thinking about the risks to himself. I owe him this." Rebecca placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, her eyes resolute. "Then we'll do this together. Not just for Ethan, but for everyone who could be the next victim of this injustice." Jack clasped Rebecca's hand tightly. With her by his side, he knew he could face whatever lay ahead. The next morning, Jack went to find Ethan. The boy was sitting on the steps of his small apartment, his face lighting up when he saw Jack. "Uncle Jack, do you have any news?" Ethan asked eagerly, his eyes filled with hope. Jack sat beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, I need your help. It might be dangerous, but I can't do this alone." Ethan nodded without hesitation, determination etched on his young face. "What do you need me to do?" Jack handed Ethan a photo of Paul Stanford. "I need you to talk to this man again. Paul's scared, but I think if it's you, he might change his mind." Ethan studied the photo before looking back at Jack. "I'll do it, for my dad, and for you." Ethan approached Paul's apartment under Jack's watchful eye from a distance. When Paul opened the door and saw the boy, he looked surprised but didn't shut the door. "Mr. Stanford, I'm Ethan, Daniel Carter's son," Ethan began, his voice soft but firm with resolve. Paul frowned, hesitated for a moment, then stepped back and motioned for Ethan to come in. Ethan met Paul's gaze, his voice trembling but impassioned. "Mr. Stanford, I know you're scared, but my dad doesn't deserve to be in prison for a crime. He didn't commit. I can't fix this on my own, but you can. If you don't speak up, the truth will stay buried forever." Paul remained silent, his expression conflicted. He looked at the boy standing before him, small but unyielding. Finally, he lowered his head and sighed. "You don't understand, Ethan. Those people, they won't leave me alone." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes shining with unwavering belief. "Do you think they can hurt you forever? If we don't stand up, they'll do this to more people. I don't want anyone else to suffer like my family has." Ethan's words hit Paul like a hammer. After a long silence, Paul nodded. "All right, Ethan, I'll tell the truth, but I need protection." Ethan smiled, his eyes glimmering with hope. "I'll tell Uncle Jack. You'll be safe." The next day, under the protection of Jack and a trusted investigative team, Paul appeared at the police station to give a new statement. He revealed that Mason had coerced him into lying, fabricated the video footage, and orchestrated the evidence framing Daniel. Mason took money from a crime syndicate to steal that shipment. Daniel was just the perfect scapegoat because he used to work as a security guard there, Paul said, his voice laced with bitterness. Jack listened, his fists clenched. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Mason hadn't just betrayed the trust of his colleagues, he had destroyed an innocent man's life to protect his own interests. Jack resolved to confront Mason head-on. He found Mason in the conference room, flipping through a file as though nothing were amiss. "Mason," Jack said, his voice firm and commanding. Mason looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's this, Jack? Another lecture?" Jack placed Paul's statement on the table, his eyes burning with anger. "I have everything I need to take you to court, Mason. Your lies, your fabricated evidence, and your corruption." Mason stood, chuckling darkly. "And what? You think you can take me down? This department needs people like me, Jack, not idealists like you." Jack stepped closer, locking eyes with Mason. "Justice doesn't need people like you. You've turned this place into a disgrace, but I'll clean it up." Mason tried to leave the room, but Jack's team blocked the door. He was handcuffed on the spot, and Jack didn't take his eyes off him until he was led away. Jack stood by the window of his office, his gaze fixed on the morning sunlight streaming through the towering buildings. A sense of relief hadn't fully settled in, even though Mason had been arrested. Over the past few days, Jack had dedicated every moment to preparing evidence, collaborating with his trusted investigative team, and organizing witness testimonies, particularly that of Paul Stanford. Finally, everything was ready. Today, Daniel Carter's case would be reopened in a special hearing. Jack knew this wasn't just an opportunity to exonerate Daniel, but a statement that truth holds value, no matter how dangerous the pursuit. Ethan, his mother, Helen, and Jack entered the courtroom together. Ethan held his mother's hand tightly, trying to maintain his composure as he saw his father, Daniel, being escorted in handcuffs. Daniel's face looked weary, but his eyes shone with faith as he saw his family. Jack stepped forward, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and whispered, "Today is your day. I'll do everything I can to bring you home." Daniel nodded, his voice steady yet low. "I trust you, Jack, and I trust Ethan." The hearing began, the tension in the courtroom palpable. The prosecution presented the old evidence, emphasizing that the surveillance video and previous witness testimonies used to convict Daniel were irrefutable. When it was Jack's turn to present, he approached the stand with an air of confidence balanced by careful precision. "Your Honor, I request a review of the evidence in this case. The original evidence was tampered with by an individual within the investigative system." He detailed how the surveillance footage had been altered, key card data erased, and, most critically, the new testimony of Paul Stanford, who'd been coerced into giving false statements. Paul was summoned to testify. He walked to the stand, visibly nervous, but regained his composure when he spotted Ethan sitting in the back row. "My initial testimony wasn't truthful," Paul began, his voice trembling but clear. "I was threatened and forced by Lieutenant Mason to claim I saw Mr. Daniel Carter at the scene when, in fact, I saw nothing of the sort." Paul's words sent a wave of murmurs through the courtroom. The prosecution attempted to discredit him, but Jack swiftly presented additional evidence showing Mason had accepted bribes from a criminal syndicate to fabricate the case. Jack concluded his presentation with a firm declaration. "No one has the right to strip an innocent person of their freedom for personal gain. Daniel Carter has lost over a year of his life to this injustice. Today, I ask to return to him what he truly deserves, his freedom and his dignity." The judge remained silent for a long moment before delivering the verdict. "Based on the new evidence and witness testimony, we hereby overturn the conviction of Mr. Daniel Carter. He is to be released immediately." Ethan let out a small cry, his eyes filled with tears as he watched his father walk down from the stand, the handcuffs being removed. Daniel embraced his wife and son tightly, tears streaming down his face, but a smile lit up his expression. "I knew you'd never give up on me, Ethan," Daniel whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You were my only light in the darkest days." Mason couldn't evade the truth any longer. After his arrest, he faced a series of charges ranging from evidence tampering and bribery to abuse of power. Mason's case not only exposed individual corruption, but also shook the system to its core. Jack, despite facing significant pressure from former colleagues, remained resolute in his mission to clean up the system. He found strong support from Rebecca, who stood by him throughout the journey. A few days later, Jack visited the Carter family. In their small apartment, Daniel had begun fixing old furniture and rearranging what had been neglected. "Jack, I owe you so much," Daniel said, his eyes brimming with gratitude. Jack shook his head with a smile. "You owe me nothing. The one who truly made this happen is Ethan. That boy taught me that justice must never stay silent." Ethan entered the room and hugged Jack tightly. "Thank you, Uncle Jack. You gave my family everything back." Rebecca helped Helen secure a more stable job at a small office nearby. Daniel accepted an offer from Jack to work as a maintenance staff member at the police department, where he could rebuild his life. Ethan, inspired by his family's ordeal and fueled by his belief in justice and courage, decided he would one day become a lawyer. His father's old watch, now repaired, became a symbol of the Carter family's journey, from darkness into light. The sun peeked out from behind the old buildings of the impoverished neighborhood, but this time its light felt warmer. The Carter family had finally found peace after a long year living in the shadows. In their small apartment, laughter echoed as Ethan helped his father sort through old belongings. Daniel, now free of his wearied expression, carefully polished an old watch, a symbol of patience and hope that had sustained him throughout his time in prison. "This watch carried us through the hardest days," Daniel said, his eyes glimmering as he handed it to Ethan. "Now it belongs to you." Ethan smiled, taking the watch and fastening it to his wrist. "I'll never forget what our family has been through, Dad, and I'll keep this faith alive." At the police station, Daniel started his new job as a maintenance worker. While it wasn't a high-ranking position, to him it was a deeply meaningful new beginning. Jack often stopped by to chat and encourage him, and Rebecca occasionally brought over snacks to share. With Rebecca's help, Helen found a stable job at an office near home, sparing her from the exhausting work she used to endure. Life for the Carter family gradually returned to normal, but now they lived with profound gratitude and hope. Ethan wasn't just the pride of his family, he had become a little hero to the whole neighborhood. A photo of him helping Rebecca went viral on social media, inspiring admiration for his courage. His school recognized his actions and awarded him a special scholarship to support his dreams. One afternoon, Ethan visited the police station to thank Jack. He carried a small notebook filled with lessons he had learned throughout their journey. "Uncle Jack, I want to thank you for believing in me. I'll never forget what you and Aunt Rebecca have done for my family," Ethan said, his eyes shining. Jack glanced at the notebook and smiled with pride. "Ethan, you've taught me an invaluable lesson. Never stop pursuing justice, no matter how difficult the road." That evening, the Carter family gathered around a modest yet warm dinner table. Helen chuckled as Daniel and Ethan playfully argued about who wrapped gifts better. "Everyone, I have something to say," Ethan announced, his face serious. The family fell silent, all eyes on him. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through. I want to help people like Dad, those who've been treated unfairly. I want to become a lawyer." Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes misty. "Ethan, I believe you can do it. You'll fight for justice, not just for our family, but for so many others." Helen smiled warmly, nodding. "My son, I've always been proud of you. We'll be here, always supporting you." A few weeks later, Jack arranged a meeting between Ethan and an organization offering free legal aid to the disadvantaged. There, Ethan met Laura Winslow, a renowned lawyer known for her dedication to justice. "So, you're the famous Ethan Jack's been telling me about?" Laura said, smiling as she shook his hand. "You have an inspiring story. We need people like you in the future." Ethan, though slightly nervous, responded with determination. "I just want to learn and help others. I think if I can do something, it might make the world a better place." Laura exchanged a knowing smile with Jack and Rebecca before nodding. "Then let's start today, Ethan. We'll help prepare you for your journey." As Ethan stepped out of the building, he looked up at the clear blue sky. His father's watch remained securely on his wrist, a constant reminder that this journey wasn't just his own. It belonged to his family and community as well. Rebecca and Jack stood by the curb, smiling as they watched him leave. Rebecca leaned toward Jack and said softly, "That boy is going to do something extraordinary, Jack." Jack nodded, his gaze filled with pride. "I know. Ethan isn't just a brave kid, he's a symbol of change." With every step, Ethan felt a new future unfolding before him, a future where he wasn't just retelling his story, but also writing new ones about justice, hope, and courage. Ethan stepped into the office of the Free Legal Aid Organization for the first time. The space was compact but orderly, with walls adorned with photos of successful cases and the people they had helped. Mrs. Laura Winslow, whom he had met the week before, was waiting at the reception desk. "Ethan, you're here. Let's get started." Mrs. Laura greeted him with a warm smile. Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. Today marked the beginning of his volunteer work at the organization. Though his role was limited to data entry and organizing files, it was his first step toward becoming a lawyer. In the first few weeks, Ethan spent his time learning how to manage documents, take notes from depositions, and familiarize himself with legal procedures. Often, he stayed late, poring over case files to understand the lives of the people the organization had helped. One day, Mrs. Laura brought a new stack of files and placed them in front of Ethan. "These are the cases we're currently working on. Pick one that interests you, and we'll discuss it," she said. Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes lighting up as he read stories of people who had endured immense hardship yet displayed incredible resilience. He stopped at one file, a single father who had lost custody of his child due to a wrongful accusation of domestic abuse. "Mrs. Laura, this case, it's like my dad's," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "This person needs help." Mrs. Laura smiled. "Good choice, Ethan. Let's work on this one together. We'll help him get justice." Ethan quickly proved to be more than just a determined young man. He was sharp and insightful. He helped identify flaws in the evidence, conducted interviews with witnesses, under Mrs. Laura's guidance, and even proposed ideas that seasoned attorneys sometimes overlooked. One day, after wrapping up a meeting about the case, Mrs. Laura called Ethan into her office. "Ethan, you have tremendous potential, but potential needs nurturing. Would you like to attend a basic legal skills course? I'll cover all the costs." Ethan couldn't believe his ears. He looked at Mrs. Laura, his eyes wide with excitement. "I'd love to. Thank you so much." Beyond his work at the organization, Ethan often returned to his impoverished neighborhood. He shared his family's story with friends and other kids growing up in tough circumstances. One day, he stood in front of a group of students from his community to talk about his journey. "I used to think I had no value in the eyes of the world, but thanks to the faith of my family and those around me, I learned that each of us has the power to make a difference. Justice isn't some distant ideal. It starts with your courage." Ethan's words resonated deeply with his audience. From a boy who used to walk through narrow alleys with his head down, he had become a guiding light for others. At their small apartment, Daniel, Helen, and Ethan sat together after dinner. Daniel smiled, looking at his son with pride. "Ethan, you've accomplished more than I ever dared to dream. Have you thought about continuing your education to become a professional lawyer?" Ethan nodded, gripping his father's hand firmly. "I've made up my mind, Dad. I'll do everything I can to get into law school. I want to help people like you, those who've been treated unfairly and have no voice." Helen smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Son, you're proof that we can change anything as long as we don't give up." 5 years later, Ethan graduated from law school with honors, thanks to the support of the legal aid organization and a special scholarship he received. On his graduation day, Ethan received a letter from Jack and Rebecca. "Dear Ethan, we always believed you would achieve great things. But more importantly, you've kept your heart pure and your faith in justice strong. We are so proud of you. Continue this journey, and never forget what you've done for your family and for us. With love, Jack and Rebecca." As he read the letter, Ethan felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He had not only achieved his personal goals but also become a symbol of hope and change, just as Jack had envisioned. Ethan's story didn't end there. As a passionate young lawyer, he returned to the neighborhood where he grew up and opened a small legal office to assist the underprivileged. Every day, Ethan looked at his father's watch, now fully repaired, and remembered the difficult times they had endured. He knew that justice wasn't just an abstract ideal. It was something anyone could achieve with enough courage and determination. Years passed, and the story of Ethan and the Carter family became not just an inspiration in their impoverished neighborhood, but spread throughout the city. Ethan, now a highly respected lawyer, continued to dedicate his life to helping the voiceless. His small legal office in the old neighborhood became a beacon of hope for those seeking justice, no matter who they were. One morning, as Ethan was organizing some files, an elderly woman walked in. She appeared tired but had a determined look in her eyes. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Ethan invited her to sit down and listened intently to her story. The woman, whose name was Marjorie, explained that her family had lost their home due to an unjust lawsuit. A large corporation had falsified documents to seize their property, and the local court had refused to accept her appeal. Ethan frowned, sensing the profound injustice in her tale. "I'll help you, but this case seems complicated. We'll be up against a powerful opponent," Ethan said firmly. Marjorie looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "I believe in you. I've heard your story and your family's. If anyone can help us, it's you." Ethan sought advice from Jack, who was now retired but remained a guiding figure in his life, like a spiritual father. "Jack, this case is tough. The company has both money and influence. I'm worried I might not have what it takes to fight them," Ethan admitted, a hint of doubt in his voice. Jack placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, his gaze brimming with confidence. "Ethan, you've faced bigger challenges than this. Remember, justice isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. You're not just fighting for Mrs. Marjorie, you're standing up for everyone too afraid to fight because they think no one cares enough to help them." Jack's words reignited Ethan's resolve. He decided to assemble a team of passionate young lawyers at his office to tackle the case together. The legal battle lasted several months, marked by intense courtroom showdowns. Ethan's team worked tirelessly to gather evidence, locate witnesses, and counter the company's underhanded tactics. Whenever discouragement crept in, Ethan thought of his family, of the days he stood beside his father in court, and of his promise never to let anyone endure the same injustice his father had suffered. Finally, after numerous grueling hearings, the verdict was announced. Mrs. Marjorie and her family were to have their home restored, along with compensation from the corporation. Upon hearing the decision, Mrs. Marjorie couldn't hold back her tears. She turned to Ethan, clasping his hands tightly. "You haven't just saved my family, you've restored my faith in justice." Ethan smiled, feeling a profound sense of relief and fulfillment. He knew this victory wasn't just for one family. It was a message to all who struggled. Justice still existed. Ethan's office continued to grow, evolving into a hub not only for legal work but also for training young lawyers dedicated to serving the community. He hosted free workshops for neighborhood residents, teaching them about their legal rights and how to protect them. One day, a young boy knocked on the door of Ethan's office. The boy, about 12 years old, timidly said, "I want to learn how to be like you. Will you teach me?" Ethan looked at the boy, seeing a reflection of his younger self. He smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Of course. But first, you need to know that to do this, you must have courage and a heart. Full of integrity. Are you ready for that?" The boy nodded, his eyes shining with determination. Years later, the story of Ethan Carter became more than just a tale of one wrongful case or a single legal battle. It stood as a symbol of courage, the power of belief, and the ability to change the world through even the smallest acts of kindness. The old watch that Ethan's father had given him now rested in a glass case at his office, a constant reminder that every great journey begins with courage. Ethan not only became a successful lawyer but also a mentor and companion to all who sought justice. His legacy continued to inspire generations, a light that never faded. As time passed, Ethan Carter's law office became a symbol of hope in the impoverished neighborhood. The people there no longer hesitated or feared standing up against injustice, knowing they had a place to turn to, where Ethan and his team worked tirelessly to uphold justice. One day, Ethan received a letter from Global Justice Initiative, an international network of lawyers dedicated to aiding the oppressed worldwide. They extended an invitation for Ethan to join their advisory board, aiming to bring justice to regions where the legal system was weak or non-existent. We believe your story and your fight for justice in your local community can inspire and expand efforts on a global scale, the letter read. Ethan sat in his modest office, reading the letter over and over again. He felt a surge of pride, but also a pang of hesitation. Working with the organization would mean leaving the neighborhood that had shaped him, the place where he had pledged to serve. Ethan called a meeting with his team, including the young lawyers he had mentored. "I want to hear your thoughts," Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. "This opportunity could open a new chapter, but I'm worried that if I leave, we might lose the connection we've built with this community." One of the young lawyers, Claire, stepped forward, her eyes filled with admiration. "Ethan, you've inspired all of us. If you leave, we'll carry on what you started. This office will never lose its spirit because you've built a legacy that's stronger than any single person." Claire's words moved Ethan deeply. He looked around the room that had been his starting point and realized he was no longer alone in his mission. A few weeks later, Ethan decided to accept the invitation from the Global Justice Initiative. Before departing, he organized a gathering with the neighborhood, a chance to express his gratitude and say goodbye. At the event, Jack and Rebecca were there, carrying a small gift, a framed photo of Ethan standing with the Carter family on the day Daniel was freed. Jack smiled, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, you're not just the pride of our family. You're a symbol of change. You've shown that no matter where we start, we can achieve great things if we don't give up." Rebecca added, "And we know that no matter how far you go, your heart will always be here." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Holding the photo frame, he smiled brightly. "I'll never forget what you've all done for me and my family. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a new chapter." Ethan began his work with the Global Justice Initiative, traveling to places where injustice thrived and the legal system was almost non-existent. In a small village in Africa, he helped a group of women reclaim land that had been stolen by local powers. In Southeast Asia, he and his team fought for children forced into illegal labor. Everywhere Ethan went, he left behind more than legal victories. He planted seeds of hope and belief in justice. One day, Ethan returned to his old neighborhood to visit his family and was surprised to see a mural painted on a wall near his law office. It depicted Ethan standing among the community, his hand raised high, symbolizing justice. A local resident approached him with a warm smile. "We wanted everyone to remember that no matter where you go, your spirit will always be here, Ethan." Ethan placed his hand on the mural, feeling a deep warmth in his heart. Though the road ahead was still long, he knew he had fulfilled what his father had always wanted, to leave the world a better place, where justice was not just an idea, but a reality everyone could reach. Ethan Carter had become a household name, not just within the international legal community, but also in the hearts of the people from the old neighborhood where he grew up. What Ethan left behind wasn't just a string of successful cases, but a belief that, with courage and perseverance, justice could reach everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. During his time with the Global Justice Organization, Ethan built a network of allies, young lawyers, social activists, and visionary leaders. Together, they initiated numerous legal aid and educational projects, empowering marginalized communities to protect themselves against injustice. One day, Ethan received a call from Claire, his loyal colleague who had worked with him at the old neighborhood law office. Her voice carried a mix of joy and a hint of nervousness. "Ethan, there's someone here who needs to meet you. He says you're the reason he decided to pursue justice." Intrigued, Ethan returned to the neighborhood the very next day. As he stepped into his old office, he saw a young man waiting. The boy looked anxious, but his eyes lit up when he saw Ethan. "I'm Noah, Mr. Carter," the young man said as soon as Ethan walked in. "I met you when I was a child, and since then, I've always wanted to be like you." Noah explained that he had just graduated from law school and wanted to join Ethan's team to learn. He recounted how, years ago, Ethan's talk to the community about his journey to seek justice for his father had changed the way Noah saw the world. Ethan smiled, recalling that moment. He nodded and said, "Noah, if you want to help others, then you're ready. Justice doesn't wait for us to be perfect. It waits for us to take action." Noah quickly proved his competence and passion. Ethan assigned him smaller cases to start with, but always kept a close eye, offering guidance. Through their work, Noah not only honed his legal skills but also learned that patience and empathy were the most crucial elements in building trust with the community. One day, as Ethan and Noah were working on a complicated land dispute case, Noah remarked, "I get it now, Mr. Carter. We're not just lawyers. We're bridges between the voiceless and justice." Ethan nodded, smiling with pride. "Exactly, Noah, and I believe you'll become someone even better than me." As Noah began taking on more cases, Ethan realized he had fulfilled one of his greatest missions, passing on his spirit and skills to the next generation. His law office now boasted a team of young lawyers, each carrying their own stories and ideals, but united by a shared goal: to build a fairer world. Ethan decided to document his journey in a book titled Where Justice Begins. The book wasn't just a chronicle of his life, it was a message to anyone feeling powerless in the face of injustice. As long as you start, justice will follow you wherever you go. The book quickly became a sensation, taught in law schools and community education programs alike. Despite traveling far and wide, Ethan always returned to his family. Daniel, now retired, often sat on the porch tinkering with old tools as he used to. Helen, with her warm smile, always welcomed Ethan with a home-cooked meal whenever he visited. "Mom, Dad, I feel like everything is just beginning," Ethan said once as the family gathered around the table. Daniel chuckled, patting his son's shoulder. "That's right, Ethan. But sometimes beginning is the hardest part. The rest, you already have the heart and strength to face." Years later, as Ethan stood before a classroom of law students, he saw the same spark in their eyes that he'd once had. "You may feel like the world is too big and the injustices too overwhelming," he told them, "but remember, every change starts with the smallest actions: a brave choice, a righteous decision, a voice that refuses to stay silent." Ethan ended his lecture with his signature line, "Justice isn't something we find. It's something we build, and you will be the ones to build it." As he walked out of the classroom, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. He knew his story was no longer just his own. It had become part of a much larger journey, the journey of generations carrying the torch of justice forward. After years of working with the Global Justice Organization, Ethan had traveled across dozens of countries, confronting various injustices, from defending the rights of indigenous peoples in the Amazon rainforest to rescuing victims of forced labor in South Asia. Yet, every time he closed a case, he carried a strange feeling, a mix of triumph and the sobering realization that millions of others still needed help. One day, while writing a report in a small office in Kenya, Ethan received a call from Claire. "Ethan, there's a new case you need to know about. This time it's about a group of workers being horribly mistreated at a large factory in the U.S. It seems they're not only exploiting labor but also tied to high-level corruption." Ethan sighed, but his determined gaze betrayed no hesitation. "Send me all the details, Claire. I'll fly back immediately." Returning home, Ethan felt a sense of familiarity, but also mounting tension. This case wasn't just legally complex, it also involved powerful political and economic forces. Ethan assembled his team, including Noah and other young lawyers, to begin the investigation. They uncovered that the factory not only violated labor laws, but also employed intimidation tactics to silence workers. During a meeting, Noah suggested, "We need to meet some of the workers directly and convince them to testify. But this will be